overview what this will cover, and as well as allow Dr. Martin Javor, who is a professor of history at the University of Prešov, to also introduce himself. Mr. Javor has said that he would prefer to speak in Slovak, so we will be also translating him, but you feel free to ask your questions to him in English. He fully understands that, so it's not an issue. Okay, so this webinar is going to be exploring the Slovak exodus. The story of Slovakia is a story of migration, especially if we look at the more modern part of the story of Slovakia. So for nearly 2 decades, our people have been moving abroad in droves. And this webinar will cover the key historical signposts that also explain why 2 million Americans have Slovak roots today. The webinar will demonstrate that Slovakia is also a country that has suffered tremendous population losses, and within that category of population loss means tremendous human capital losses, with its skilled, talented, and also elite members of society leaving to go find a better life elsewhere because for various reasons, which we'll cover in this webinar, the conditions were so difficult that they had to leave. However, we are going to end this webinar on a positive note because things are changing in 21st century Slovakia. And where we can really see this change is that Slovakia is also transitioning from being just an emigration nation where people are fleeing from to an immigration nation. So yes, Slovaks are still going abroad to find work, particularly young people also to study. But our country is now also receiving immigrants, most immediately from its immediate neighbors, like Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, which we'll cover in greater detail towards the end of this webinar. So you can actually see 150 years later, this country is now going through a transition, and it's also putting a lot of pressure on our government, on our parliament, on our policies to make Slovakia a more inclusive country for the migrants that are now coming in. Okay, so Professor Javor, are you there? Hi. Would you be so kind as to give a quick introduction to yourself?
Yes.
And we'll, of course, discuss your personality and your accomplishments further at the end of the webinar.
Okay, first of all, it's an honor for me to be
I'm here. How are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm good.
Oh, Lynn.
Okay.
Sorry. It's an honor for me to be here in this beautiful webinar. You know, the history of Slovakia is history of migration. Ak však všetci dovolíte, ja budem hovoriť po slovensky, keďže všetci vaši predkovia boli Slováci. Takže pre mňa je tento jazyk veľmi dôležitý a aby ste ho trošku počuli aj zo Slovenska, tak budem hovoriť po slovensky a chcem povedať, že rozumiem samozrejme aj po anglicky, takže ak mi budete dávať otázky po anglicky, budem na nich samozrejme odpovedať.
Gabby, would you like to translate that?
Yes, so Dr. Javor would like to take this opportunity to speak in Slovak because he loves the language so much, because we are in Slovakia, and also to give you the opportunity to hear the language that's not heard so much in the world today. But of course, he understands English, so when you ask questions, he will get it and he will answer, but he will speak in Slovak.
Okay, Gabriela, thank you very much. My two grandmothers, moje dve babky sa narodili v Spojených štátoch amerických. Jedna v roku 1906 v Homestead, Pensylvánii, a druhá v Clevelande v Ohiu, a zanechali mi veľké dedičstvo Slovákov v Amerike a je neuveriteľné, ako sme my na Slovensku na toto dedičstvo zabudli.
So the grandmothers of Dr. Javor were born in the US in 1906 and 1911, correct?
Yes.
And they left behind a huge heritage of the Slovaks, of the American Slovaks, that unfortunately has been kind of silenced and sidelined, and we don't know so much about in Slovakia. So we are totally agree on this, which is why we run this awareness activity. And we have this webinar. So.
A to je dôvod, kvôli čomu ja sa problematike emigrácie vážne venujem a môjim snom je založiť múzeum emigrácie do Severnej Ameriky.
So this topic is passion for Dr. Javor, and it's also a motivation behind his activity and his desire to set up a museum of migration to North America here in Slovakia.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Javor. So I will also introduce myself a little bit. So my name is Zuzana Palovic. I have a PhD in migration. I also wrote a book about the topic, focusing most specifically on the new diaspora, which has emerged after 2004 when Slovakia ascended to the European Union. But I am a Slovak migrant several times over. I was born in communist Czechoslovakia. And about 1 year before the revolution, my family and I fled. So we illegally crossed the Iron Curtain. We became political refugees. We lived through the various refugee camps that were home to many of the people from the Eastern Bloc that were fleeing the totalitarian regimes. We waited there about a year before we emigrated to Canada, where we eventually became naturalized citizens. So I am actually a dual citizen between Canada and Slovakia. More so, I had the privilege to grow up in Canada and in the United States. And after completing my first education, my bachelor's degree in the US, I actually decided to return. And I returned first to Slovakia, and then I went to study abroad in the United Kingdom. This is where I experienced migration as an EU migrant with my Slovak passport. It was in the United Kingdom. I actually did my PhD, which specialized on the Slovak diaspora, looking at the new diaspora and what it means for Slovakia in terms of development. And since then, I have come back and established Global Slovakia, the NGO that Gabrielle and I run, with the ambition to share Slovakia with the world. And as Gabrielle already said it, we do it mostly through the form of storytelling, through the form of books, but we do want to transition into film quite soon. Nevertheless, that aside, migration is something that is very, very close to my heart on a personal level because I experienced it, but so did my forefathers. My great-grandfather from my father's side, he was from the Liptov region, and he actually migrated to the United States and worked in the Pittsburgh coal mines, not once, but twice. During the peak of the migration wave that happened at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. However, he did not stay on in the United States. He actually returned both times so that he could help to sustain and support his expanding family of 10 children in the Liptov region. So migration has been affecting my life and the life of my predecessors for some 100 years. So it's very, very close to me and also professionally. And I hope to share some of that professional knowledge here with you, along with Dr. Javor. And I would just like to also give a shout out or a thank you to Professor Michal Kopanek from the University of Maryland in the US. He has also done some great research on the Slovak diaspora, the original one that happened during the time Slovakia was part of the Kingdom of Hungary. And so he has provided some great data as well for this webinar. So it's going to be very educational, we hope, for you. So let's get started with looking at the first wave of Slovak emigration into the United States. Just going to wait a second to get the PowerPoint. Okay, I'm not sure if you guys are seeing it. For me, it's a little bit of a blank screen, but let me just get started and hopefully the visual, yeah, so there it is, great. So we're looking at the first, but before we go into the story of that, we need to situate ourselves, contextualize ourselves a little bit. So we're looking at Uhorsko in the 19th century. Uhorsko is the way Slovaks referred to the Kingdom of Hungary. Slovakia was not a province, but a region, the northern region of the Kingdom of Hungary. And the Kingdom of Hungary was actually a conglomerate of different ethnicities and cultures and languages, of which Slovakia was a part of. So it was during this era that we witnessed the first, and I would say maybe one of the largest exoduses out of Slovakia, out of the territory of present-day Slovakia into the United States. And the context is we're now looking at the year 1848. So even though feudalism was officially abolished in this year following the 1848 revolution, the National Awakening, a society of peasants and de facto lords persisted on the territory of Slovakia. So although there was this conceptual shift in the society, on the ground, the reality pretty much stayed the same as it was before. Furthermore, life was very, very difficult, particularly in the eastern part of the country that really suffered from agricultural hardship, which resulted in poverty, but also hunger. So one of the main drivers of out-migration, the push factor, was actually poverty and hunger, and not so much Magyarization, as Professor Javor will further explain. That was more a subsidiary issue. The main issue was the fact that people didn't have enough to eat. They didn't have enough to feed their children. So the men had to go find work wherever they could. And that meant going to America in this case. So most of the out-migrants came from the eastern Slovak regions of Šariš, Spiš, Zemplín. And the first wave of laborers that left were mostly landless laborers. They were later joined by workers and then peasants. Historical records show that these first waves were pretty much what you would call the people at the bottom levels of society that were quite vulnerable and were frankly starving. So very few professionals came to America during this period because if they did have a higher education or even a university education, that means that they could kind of self-actualize themselves within the context of the region. They could speak German or they could speak Hungarian, and that's where they could get career growth. They obviously did not speak English, so going to America would mean starting really from scratch all over again. Nevertheless, we do have to acknowledge that Magyarization, although it was not the main driving force behind the large-scale out-migration, it definitely played a role in shaping the opportunity structure for Slovaks within the Kingdom of Hungary. In terms of limiting access to education, Slovaks could not study in their mother tongue, and of course limiting access to work opportunities, because if you wanted to work in the administration or in any of these institutions, you needed to speak the Magyar language. Therefore, this greatly curtailed not only financial access, but also quality of life, which was definitely a contextual reason that pushed people into more difficult situations and ultimately into emigration. And we do have to observe that Dr. Javor will talk about this more in depth. There were 3 waves of out-migration that occurred between 1874 and the First World War. But we can observe that migration dramatically decreased into the United States from Slovakia or from Europe in general after the end of the First World War because of immigration quotas imposed by the US government. So that was when the United States said, okay, whoa, we have enough people. They away closed the door to Europe, and by doing that, they closed the flow of incoming people that were coming on boats from the old continent to the new world. Just to give you some quick facts, which are very, very interesting about Slovaks in America. So again, as a contextual reference, there were some 2 million Slovaks that were registered as Slovaks within the Kingdom of Hungary. And out of those 2 million, about 1/3 emigrated. So that's a tremendous population loss. Many of these people actually came at first just to work with the intention to return. But once they came to the New World and they somehow stabilized a little bit, some or in fact most send for their family members to join them. That is predominantly their wives and their children to come to America. And this is how Slovakia is actually referred to as having the largest emigrating population out of Europe, second only to Ireland. And so we all kind of know the Irish context and just how many people Ireland lost because the Irish are such an important community in America. So we can kind of have a frame of reference of what that meant for Slovakia. Yes, the Slovak population was smaller to the Irish one, but per capita, we suffered the same dramatic effect on our society from this exodus, from this population loss. And again, as a very interesting reference, in 1920, there were some 620,000 Slovaks registered in America. And the most popular destinations for these people were in the East Coast, in the Northeast. They were Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Cleveland, Ohio, New Jersey, and New York, because that's where the work opportunity were. That's where the mines were, and later that's where also the industry was, where they found jobs. And it's for this reason that actually the city of Pittsburgh and later Cleveland were referred to as the largest or second largest settlements of Slovaks. So outside of Budapest, which had the largest Slovak population, it was actually Pittsburgh and later Cleveland, because that's where people went, because that's where they could survive. And so it's for this reason that in the 1990 US Census, there were some 2 million Americans that registered to have Slovak ancestry. So this is the reason why. And one final thing before I hand it over to Dr. Javor, I've had these questions before. I myself was interested. How did they travel to the New World? What was it like? So what we found in the history books is that the journeys were about 15 to 60 days on boat. They were pretty difficult conditions because Slovaks didn't have the money to buy the more comfortable tickets, so they were pretty much stacked like sardines, sleeping on little cots in the bottom of the boat. They left via Germany, and most entered through Ellis Island in New York. The two main ports that they left through in North Germany were Bremen and Hamburg. And once they came to the US, they actually organized communities and created what migration would refer to as ethnic enclaves, especially at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. And these were mostly organized also around the church. So most Slovaks at this point in time, just as today, were Catholic. So once they came to the New World and once they secured their livelihood, the next thing they wanted was their connection to God. So then they had their Slovak church where they actually had service in the Slovak language. And through that, various associations formed, one of which still exists today and is wildly popular actually within the Slovak American community, and that's Jednota. And Jednota was a fraternal society which served a religious purpose, but it also promoted Slovak nationality and heritage and also language in the US. And of course, their business model was providing insurance or life insurance. And this was a very serious issue because many of the laborers, they worked in very difficult and challenging conditions in the mines, but also in the various industries, and lives were unfortunately lost. And when these lives of these Slovak migrants were lost, the person most affected was, of course, the family, but in this case, it was the wife, the widow, that was then left to provide for herself, but also for their children. So these organizations, the Jajky Jednota, emerged out of need to help be kind of a financial support to families in need if they did lose the main breadwinner, which was the man. So Dr. Javor, I hand it over to you.
Yes. Zuzana, it was perfect. When you will be my student, I will give you 100%.
Thank you. Thank you.
It was unbelievable situation at Hungary at the second half of 19th century. Hlavným dôvodom emigrácie bola hospodárska situácia. A hlavným ďalším dôvodom bola obrovská nevzdelanosť v strednej Európe. Nielen na Slovensku, ale v strednej Európe in general.
So the two main reasons behind this great migration wave was the bad economic situation in Slovakia, but also the low education standard.
Viete, tu je najlepšie.
Levels, not just in Slovakia, but in general in Central Europe.
Viete, tí ľudia nemali absolútne žiadnu predstavu, kde je Amerika. Keď prišiel agent, ktorý z veľkých lodných spoločností zbieral ľudí do veľkých lodí z Hamburgu a z Brem, tak nikto nevedel, kde Amerika sa nachádza. Ja mám príbeh osobný z mojej rodiny, kde môj prastarý otec, ktorý odišiel do Spojených štátov amerických, si myslel, že Amerika je tu pri Poprade, pri Vysokých Tatrách.
Okay, so most people, they had no idea where America was or how far it was. So when these agents came in to recruit people, they simply did not know what they were in for. And Dr. Javor has a story from a family where one family member thought that America was somewhere near Poprad in Slovakia.
Yes, it was unbelievable. And another problem of the situation of Slovaks in this region was alcoholism. V štatistikách je popísané, že až 60% mužského obyvateľstva bolo závislých od alkoholu.
So another big reason, an unsuspecting one behind this all, was alcoholism in Slovakia, and the statistics reveal that around 60% of adult male population of the country were drinking heavily.
Viete, a ten alkoholizmus sa vlastne prenáša cez tie slovenské dejiny neuveriteľne. Ja mám správy z návrátilcov, lebo viete, málo ktorý z prvej vlny emigrácie chcel ostať v Severnej Amerike. Väčšinou tí ľudia chceli zarobiť peniaze a vrátiť sa naspäť do kraju, na Slovensko, vyplatiť svoje dlhy a tak ďalej. Ale máme neuveriteľné príbehy, ako oni vlastne všetky peniaze, ktoré zarobili v Amerike, boli schopní prepiť ešte len na ceste naspäť na Slovensko. Ešte aj nedošli naspäť a už tie peniaze de facto nemali. Takže ten alkoholizmus bol obrovskou metlou, ktorá veľmi zamávala tým slovenským národom v 19. storočí.
So people were often leaving Slovakia in order to earn enough money to pay off their drinking debts. But the alcoholism was so ingrained, the impulse was so strong that many of those people, when they left to earn the money, then they plan on to coming back to the country. They didn't really have a desire to stay. But the issue was that they carried on drinking, and so they accumulated more debts or spent all the money that they had earned in the US on board the ships coming back to Slovakia. So alcoholism was an issue, was a problem that marked Slovakia greatly in the 19th century.
No, pýtali ste sa na ten samotný prevoz do Spojených štátov. Obrovské lodné spoločnosti mali po strednej Európe svojich agentov, ktorí predávali lodné lístky z Hamburgu a z Brém rovno do Ameriky. Ja si neviem predstaviť tú situáciu a máme niekoľko zápiskov, memoárov, keď človek, ktorý nevedel jazyk, ktorý nemal ani cent, vystúpil v Castle Garden v New Yorku a mal nejakým spôsobom zabezpečiť svoje živobytie. Ale k tomu sa ešte dostaneme. Tí agenti... Okay.
As to the transportation itself, so there was no internet, obviously, where you could purchase tickets back in the day. So how it worked was these big companies who ran the links between Europe and America had their agents in Slovakia selling tickets directly to the people.
Títo agenti často predražene predávali tieto lístky. Stávalo sa, že Slováci predávali svoje nehnuteľnosti, hospodárstvo, kravy, dobytok, všetko len, aby si mohli kúpiť jeden lístok do Severnej Ameriky.
So these tickets were hugely expensive, and it's possible that the agents too artificially increased the price. And so people in Slovakia were selling their properties, they were selling their cattle, sold what they had in order to be able to afford that ticket and go.
Samozrejme, problémom bolo aj to, že väčšina týchto agentov boli podvodníci a stávali sa aj prípady, keď človek prešiel. Väčšinou to bolo tak, že z územia Slovenska sa ľudia kočmi dostávali do Krakova a z Krakova vlakom potom do Brém alebo do Hamburgu. A stávalo sa často, že tie lístky, ktoré mali kúpené, neboli platné a nikto ich na loď nezobral. Takže vysťahovalectvo bol jeden obrovský biznis, na ktorom zarobili práve tieto lodné spoločnosti.
So many of these agents were swindlers and they were selling tickets that were not valid. So when Slovaks eventually made it to Germany, to Bremen or Hamburg via Poland, they would not even be admitted onto the ship. So this emigration was a huge business, and the parties that profited were the companies themselves, the transportation companies.
Postupne si aj vláda v Uhorsku, tejto otázke sa ja profesionálne venujem, postupne si vláda v Uhorsku uvedomila vážnosť situácie, keď sa vyľudnili celé regióny a v celých dedinách nemali ste jedného chlapa, ktorý by mohol robiť práce, ktoré sa robili dovtedy na poli a tak ďalej.
So many people were emigrating at the time. It became a grave issue that was recognized by the Kingdom of Hungary, because it got to the point when in certain villages, in certain regions, there were no people left behind. Most importantly, there were no men that could work in the fields.
Spočiatku oni podporovali tú migráciu Slovákov hlavne. A to z toho dôvodu, že keďže Slováci odchádzali, tak im sa zväčšoval podiel Maďarov v monarchii. Oni to spočiatku chápali ako národnú možnosť, zvyšoval sa im počet Maďarov a tým pádom vlastne chceli vytvoriť tú maďarskú alebo tú uhorskú jednonárodnú spoločnosť. Takže spočiatku tú migráciu podporovali, alebo teda nechali ju tak, ale potom, keď si uvedomili tie obrovské hospodárske dôsledky, tak sa snažili rôznymi zákonmi zamedziť ľuďom, aby odchádzali preč, ale samozrejme títo ľudia to obchádzali a často nelegálne odchádzali z krajiny. Veľká väčšina ľudí odišla de facto z územia Uhorska nelegálne.
So the immigration was at first sort of tacitly supported by the government of the Kingdom of Hungary because this was beneficial to begin with Slovaks were leaving the kingdom, which increased the proportion of the population that identified as Hungarian, which was in alignment with the Magyarization policy, where the Hungarians were trying to create one nation with one language and one culture. So it was good for them if there were not that many Slovaks disrupting the ethnic homogeneity. But when the economic impact of these mass emigrations kicked in, they realized this was dangerous and harmful to them. So measures were approved to stop Slovaks from leaving the kingdom. But Slovaks did it anyway. And so as Dr. Martin Javor said, most of them at the time had to emigrate illegally. So they had to bypass the rules and the laws in order to get out.
And I actually, we have a question here from our audience, from our chat, and I think it's really good to address. Why wasn't there work or food in the mid to late 1800s in Slovakia? Was the government limiting them? What's the reason why there was so much starvation and hunger?
It is a very good question. Situácia na území Slovenska bola veľmi vážna. V roku 1874 postihlo územie Uhorska veľké nešťastie, bola to cholera.
So the situation in Slovakia was caused by epidemic that happened in 1874. What is cholera in English, Zuzi? Sorry, I don't know.
Yeah, it's the same, cholera.
It's the same cholera. Okay, so.
Cholera. Táto cholera ešte viac zbedačila národ žijúci v strednej Európe, alebo národy žijúce v strednej Európe. A to bolo z toho dôvodu, že počas tejto epidémie cholery veľká väčšina obyvateľstva opäť buď zomiera, alebo chudobne je ešte viac. Ďalším problémom bolo to, že vlastne väčšinu pôdy v Uhorsku vlastnili veľkostatkári. Bola to väčšinou uhorská alebo aj slovenská šľachta. A pre tých drobných roľníkov, sedliakov bola pôda veľmi rozkuskovaná a nebola schopná uživiť tie obrovské rodiny, ktoré na Slovensku boli. Uvedome si, že priemer koncom 19. storočia mali slovenské rodiny 7 až 9 detí.
Okay, so the cholera disease that came in killed many people. The others were subject to dire conditions, and in general, like countries or the poorest segments of the society became even poorer during this time. So that's one reason. The second one is that the majority of the land in Slovakia was owned by aristocracy, by nobility most often. And the land that was owned by the people on the bottom, so the peasants, was so fragmented that it was not capable of supporting the large Slovak families. On average, people had 7 to 9 children at the time.
A tretí dôvod, Gabika, tretí dôvod je ten, že to poľnohospodárstvo v Uhorsku bolo zaostalé. To si musíme priznať. Kým v západnej Európe a v Amerike tá mechanizácia v poľnohospodárstve bola veľmi rýchla, tak na území Uhorska sa hospodárilo ako pred 500 rokmi. Hej, to si napríklad všimli aj emigranti, ktorí zo Slovenska odchádzali a ktorí písali listy naspäť na Slovensko, aké je poľnohospodárstvo v Amerike. Oni boli hotoví z toho, že sa to dá robiť aj inak, ako to oni robia na Slovensku.
And also the third very important reason is that the agriculture, but generally the country, was backward, while Western countries really jumped on the industrialization trend and they were evolving and developing. This was not the case in the Kingdom of Hungary. And so we do even have records from the immigrants themselves who were amazed when they came to America and saw all the technologies and saw all the other ways it was possible to do stuff that in Slovakia was done, as if it was deep Middle Ages still.
We have one more question right now from the chat. I'm going to try my best to answer this one. It says, were the people left behind in Slovakia resentful of those that had brackets abandoned them? And yes, that was a trend, and that was a reaction in the society in general. And perhaps also because abandonment did happen, let's say a wife and child or wife and children were left behind by a husband that decided to establish a new family in America or a new life in America. I'm sure that did happen. Or they never heard of him again because he did perish in a work accident in the mines, and unfortunately that information didn't come back to them. But in general, if you're imagining the context at this time in Slovakia, what we're hearing is it was industrially backward. We're hearing there was a cholera epidemic that wiped out a lot of the population. So you can imagine people were in a state of fear of survival. There wasn't enough food. There wasn't enough opportunities to make money to buy food or to grow food because the land was controlled by, let's say, these rich or elite overlords. And so it's a cauldron of a lot of fear and powerlessness. And then you hear of a family member doing much better across the pond, maybe even achieving their American dream, in this case being purchasing their own home. Maybe their children learn how to read and write. So you can imagine there was quite a bit of resent and jealousy that also happened between families. And you have stories where Slovaks in America were sending food, clothes back to their relatives, and their relatives received it and rejected it. They refused to accept the gifts that were given to them because of this resentment, because of this jealousy, because, you think because you're over there that we're suffering and that we need these handouts. Was an attitude, or just flat out rejecting it because of pride. So unfortunately, these things were happening in the society as well.
If I can, one more thing. Oni sa obávali. They are afraid of the epidemic. In 18th century, there was epidemic of mora. What is mora in English?
The plague, huh?
The plague.
Okay, mora. It was black death. And maybe you know
already.
Maybe you know the town Michalovce is an east part of Slovakia. And what do you think? How many people stay alive after this epidemic in this town? Only 5.
Out of how many?
5 families only stay alive in 18th century in Michalovce after the epidemic of more. I don't know, it was maybe 4,000 or 5,000 people lived there before the epidemic. You know, they're afraid.
Wow.
They're afraid about.
I will put a coffee on.
Oh, sorry. If you guys can just make sure you mute yourselves, because sometimes when you speak, it interrupts interrupts the lecture. Thank you.
And I see the question why they are coming to United States and no to England. No, hlavný dôvod je ten, že aj z Anglicka ľudia odchádzali. Neviem, či ste počuli o írskom hladomore. To je vlastne katastrofálna situácia, keď vlastne oni zabudli na všetky ostatné plodiny, zasiali všade len zemiaky. A v roku 1845 tieto zemiaky postihla pleseň zemiaková a spôsobilo to, že 2 milióny Írov zomrelo a ďalšie milióny sa museli vysťahovať do Spojených štátov amerických. Takže preto oni nešli do Anglicka, ale išli do Spojených štátov.
So to answer the question why Slovaks chose America instead of England was that England too was struggling. They were also hit by a disease that attacked potato crops, which caused the Great Irish Famine and the Irish emigration. So that country was struggling too. So there was no point going there, which is why Slovaks, along with the Irish and other British people, decided to leave to where the opportunities were. And there is also one more question, then we'll move on to the next slide. When people immigrated illegally, were they able to keep their former names?
Yes. Yes. I don't know ja nemám žiadnu informáciu, aby oni menili svoje mená, nie.
I could just add to that. So they didn't have intention to change their name, but as it happened with many ethnicities that came through the ports in New York, like Ellis Island, the names were Americanized because you had American English speakers that were writing the names that were phonetically related.
Yes.
So they anglicized the names, and that's why many Slovak names that you have in America are like a slight tweaking of the Slovak spelling that you would have in Slovakia.
Yes, to je môj problém. My name is Javor. Javor. When my grandfather came to Ellis Island, he said Javor, and úradník napísal Y, Javor, not Javor. Yes, but if I can, prvé 2 vlny emigrácie zo Slovenska neboli emigrácie také, že tí ľudia tam chceli ostať. Toto je veľmi dôležité. Až 30% ľudí bolo niekoľkokrát v tej Amerike. Hej. Neboli len raz a ostali tam. Oni prišli, zarobili peniaze, vrátili sa, skúpili zeme, opäť išli do Ameriky, zarobili peniaze, opäť sa vrátili. Takže tá prvotná emigrácia nebola o tom, že oni chceli ostať v tej krajine na stálu a nechceli sa vrátiť.
So the immigration was not initially meant to be permanent. People intended to leave, earn money, come back, buy land, build houses, support their families, and they went again, and so on and so forth. So they didn't really, so we don't have a record or any information about people changing their names to something else.
Well, actually, there's 2 points there. So just to add to that, so the first 2 waves that happened at the end of the 19th century, so from 1874 to the 1900s, early 1900s, that was intended to be work migration. So it's supposed to be either one time go to America, get some cash, come back and buy land, so you can then have agricultural crops that sustain your family, your growing family. Or what ended up happening is that this migration became cyclical. So Dr. Yap, 30% of those that went by boat to the U.S. actually went multiple times, and I can attest to that in my own family because my great grandfather.
Yeah, that's in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That's the first wave. A lot of them were poor going. They didn't go like my father, or even my grandparents. Even mom's parents went differently. They left people there. They worked in mines and they were killed. It was a whole different scenario, wasn't it?
Because they were labor.
Yeah.
But why was it?
Can you mute everyone, please?
Even so, I guess the rectorists were different. They had the money.
Yeah. So I'm so sorry. I don't know.
Wasn't it? How was it different? How come?
But you're making some.
Zuzana and Martin, can you please unmute yourself?
Okay. All right. So back to the story. So the migration was from 1800s to the early 1900s. It was not intended to be permanent. It was cyclical. My own great grandfather went not once but twice to work in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania mines. And as per the names, when they did come through the ports, Dr. Javor affirmed with his own grandfather, their family name is Javor, back with a J, but for example, the U.S. administrator heard Javor with a Y, and so this is how in U.S. records, his grandfather's name is listed with a Y and not a J. So that's how the names changed. And sorry.
Ešte ak môžem, Zuzanka, ono vlastne to, že sa tí ľudia navracali naspäť, spôsobovalo obrovskú popularizáciu tej emigrácie. Si predstavte, ako odišiel chudobný človek a za niekoľko rokov prišiel a bol schopný vyplatiť svoje dlhy a kúpiť majetok. Tak videli to aj tí ostatní a to vlastne podporovalo, rozširovalo a dávalo dynamiku tej emigrácii.
So the migrants returning back to Slovakia, it actually popularized the migration even further because people who stayed could see that these people were able to earn enough money to buy lands, to build houses, etc. So they wanted to be like them. And they firsthand saw that it was possible. So this sort of incited and encouraged even more people going out. Okay, so let's make a move to wave 2.
Yes, because we actually have quite a few waves to cover. So now we're going to jump forward. So we had the First World War, we had the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, we now had the establishment of Czechoslovakia. We had 20 years of peace after the end of the First World War. And what struck Europe again was devastation in the form of the rise of the Third Reich and Hitler and his agenda. So under Hitler, let's say Czechoslovakia was annexed by Hitler. It became a satellite state under these conditions of hardship, of duress, of war, and of terror. We saw another exodus happen. This one was more limited to the elite. So those that had money, networks, connections, fled the country if they could. And they went anywhere they could. And this included going to the US, but it also included going to South America. There was also a community of Slovaks that established in Argentina. And I visited Argentina and I came personally in contact with this community. And this, just like people were coming to the United States through the ports of New York, so were people going down to Argentina, which was at the time a very rich country. It had a lot of industry, and particularly were being exported. So they also needed migrant laborers. They needed human capital to come in. And so they opened their immigration ports, and Slovaks also went down to Argentina. This relationship dynamic with Argentina continued even during the establishment of Czechoslovakia. And of course, we witnessed people leaving for various reasons during the First World War and after this, during the Second World War and after the Second World War, also to Argentina. But that is not that was emigration, but actually during this 6-year time of Hitler reigning over Slovakia, we also witnessed a lot of human capital loss, a lot of population loss in the form of war. casualties of war, but also what happened to the Jewish population of Slovakia, which was pretty much destroyed. We had over 90,000 Slovak Jews that were taken against their will. They were put in concentration camps. Their assets were taken over by the state. And after the end of the war, most did not return. So those that did survive, many of them did try to emigrate further west into a more safe country than a post-World War II Europe. After the war, there was also a mass population resettlements that happened in Slovakia and Czechoslovakia. There were 3 million ethnic Germans that had been living in Czechoslovakia, many of them for centuries. They also spoke Czech because of the post-war World War II agreements, and to subside ethnic tensions, these 3 million Germans were repatriated back to Germany. And the same happened for the Hungarian populations. We have about 90,000 Hungarians that had been living in Slovakia, many of them for centuries, or they have no actual point of reference of ever living in Hungary, but they were of Hungarian ethnicity, were then repatriated through these population exchanges back to, and a similar amount of Slovaks were exchanged back from Hungary into Slovakia. Europe in this time was experiencing huge mass population shifts and relocations, and during this period it's a not far stretch to imagine that many of these people, if they had means, contacts, networks, they use that as an opportunity to go further west into the New World, to start their life completely fresh rather than starting it again in a new country in a post-World War II destroyed Europe. Dr. Javor, would you like to add anything to this?
Yes, I think, myslím si teda, že tá emigrácia vtedy už bola iná ako v 19. storočí. Pominuli de facto hospodárske dôvody a postupne emigrácia začína byť emigráciou politickou. Chcel by som povedať, že nebola to len Argentína, kde Slováci končili. Veľká časť emigrácie putovala ďalej. Austrália a vôbec ďaleké krajiny. Bohužiaľ, na Slovensku o týchto emigrantoch nevieme absolútne nič.
So migration at this time has changed considerably. It was no longer an economic migration, now it was a political migration. And the Slovaks were not just leaving to Argentina, many of them also continued further into Australia, but sadly, we have next to no information about them.
A ešte ak môžem, ja študentom na našej univerzite hovorím, snažím sa dešifrovať, prečo je situácia na Slovensku permanentne problematická. A ten dôvod som našiel v tom, že počas 100 rokov histórie, nielen, že sa 4-krát zmenil názov krajiny, napríklad moja stará mama nevyšla preč z dediny Pavlovca nad Uhom a žila v 4 štátnych útvaroch, ale to nie je táto téma. Dôležitejšie je to, že za 100 rokov 7-krát z tohto štátu odišli tí najkvalitnejší ľudia.
So when Dr. Javor is explaining to his students why Slovakia continues to have all these challenges, he says, well, the thing is that it's not just that the name of the country changed 4 times. Like Dr. Javor's grandmother never left her home village, and she lived in 4 different countries. What matters even more is that 7 times the most qualified and the most the human potential that had the most promise and capacity, these people left in 7 waves from the country, which really impacted Slovakia and continues to be felt until today.
Prvá vlna bola práve táto emigrácia na prelome storočí, kedy, viete, lebo aj na tú emigráciu človek musel byť, väčšinou emigrovali tí najlepší z tých dedín. Takže prvá emigrácia boli tí Slováci v 19. storočí, začiatkom 20. storočia. Potom si zoberme rok 1918. kedy vlastne celá špička, keď vzniklo Československo, obrovská emigrácia ľudí, ktorí stratili svoj štát a tak ďalej, odišli preč väčšinou do Maďarska, ale takisto aj preč do Spojených štátov amerických alebo inde. Potom si zoberme 39. rok, nástup fašizmu, obrovská emigrácia po celom svete. Potom si zoberme to obrovské nešťastie, čo sa stalo slovenským Židom v 39. 45. Potom si zoberme emigráciu po nástupe komunistov v 48. A potom si zoberme emigráciu po roku 1968, keď nás obsadili sovietské armády. A nakoniec obrovskú emigráciu mladých ľudí po roku 89. Keď si toto uvedomíme, tak zistujeme, že z tejto krajiny, z tejto nádhernej krajiny nám každých 20 rokov odchádzajú tí najlepší ľudia.
Just before you jump on that, Gabby, I just want to stress that Dr. Javor is saying that Slovakia has suffered from not only population losses, but population losses of its best human capital. So we're looking at the most skilled people, and we're looking at the most driven people that have periodically left, which Gabriela will cover what years those were, which has had a significant impact on the country and the development of the country. So you imagine if the most talented people constantly leave, who are you left with to run the country? Who are you left with to develop the country? So this is something that for the last 100 years, Slovakia has been to the detriment of Slovakia's development.
So I think you summed it up perfectly, and the immigration waves are covered also in the slides.
Okay.
So if we're
all right. So what Dr. Javor was saying was that for the last 100 years, about every 20 years, every 2 decades, our country has suffered from this exodus of skilled human capital or driven human capital that have then gone abroad to different countries, mostly in the New World. And by New World, I mean Canada as well. And I mean, of course, also Australia, and in this case, Argentina, to contribute their skills and talent to help build. So they have not been contributing to where they were born. And this is a trend that is continuing even in the 21st century, but we are now seeing some changes because of Slovakia's development. Why there was another tremendous exodus happened after the Second World War with the advance of communism and the communist coup in 1948, where we saw the numbers vary according to historians. The lower numbers are 23,000 Czechs and Slovaks defected as the Iron Curtain was being built and as the political purges were happening. Other numbers state it was 200,000 Slovaks, Czechs and Slovaks that defected from the country after the communist coup. And again, those were the most skilled, some of the most skilled professionals in the country. And the reason they were leaving was political. This is now again political migration, not economic migration. And that's because there were political purges happening because of the Communist Party. The Communist Party wanted to get rid of any competition that stood in their way of total control over the country. And so they were going after political opposition. So those were the politicians. They were going after the intellectuals, the intelligentsia, but they were also going after the spiritual priests, the spiritual class. So the priests and nuns and monks that were part of the church, the Catholic Church most immediately. So all these people, if they could, and if that meant it saved their lives and the lives of their family, they left. And during this period, we have to have the context that over 250,000 Czechoslovaks were accused of false charges and fabricated political crimes. And because of these fabricated political crimes, they were either sentenced to death. Some of them were hung in the early 50s, or others were sent to work in hard labor camps in the uranium mines. So that was the major push factor, was this duress. And then 20 years later, after 1948, if we can go to the next slide. Gabby, yeah, perfect. So 20 years later, after the communist coup, you know, we had the rise of Alexander Dubček. Sorry, one more back. We had the rise of Alexander Dubček, the Prague Spring, the liberalization of the totalitarian rule over the country. And then the unfortunate thing happened on August 21st, 1968, is that Czechoslovakia was invaded by 500,000 soldiers, tanks, and planes with the intention to invade and later occupy the country. And that is exactly what they did. And under these conditions, Gabby, if we can go back on the slides. Oh, sorry, I guess it's frozen. So in 1968, after that, a year or two after the invasion and occupation of the Soviet forces, about 100,000 Czechs and Slovaks defected, but there are also numbers that say it's up to 500,000. So up to 500,000 Czechs and Slovaks defected from 68 to 1989 when the regime ultimately collapsed. And again, these were the most skilled, most competent people in our country, because those were the people in the know, and those were the people that had the networks and the capital to leave. And they left because they couldn't ideologically take the circumstance. Sure, they would have enough food to eat, they would have heating, they would have warm water in their flats, but that wasn't enough for them. They wanted freedom. And so to secure their freedom, they decided to go elsewhere. And then in 1989, the regime collapsed. So you had, after 41 years, a population of Slovaks that were geographically contained against their will behind the Iron Curtain, all of a sudden given the freedom to move, which was tremendous. I mean, we really have to understand that there was no movement. It was extremely difficult to get a permit to go to Yugoslavia, let alone to go anywhere in the West. So in 1989, we witnessed another immigration wave happen. However, this one was no longer political. So people weren't fleeing the Soviet occupation, the Soviets. People weren't fleeing Stalin. People weren't fleeing Hitler. In fact, they pulled abroad by opportunities to make more money in Germany and Austria, our most immediate neighbors and very strong economies that are always in need of cheap labor, even today. And they were also being pulled abroad by the forbidden fruit of the West. You know, for those 4 decades, the West was the big bad wolf. It was the bad guy. It was the oppressor. It was enemy number one. And all of a sudden, it was possible to go and experience it. So many people used the open borders to go and see the world, or to go and see Europe. And some stayed on because during the transition from the planned economy, the free market economy that happened with the establishment of capitalism and democracy here after 1989, there was great instability. And again, people didn't know if they would have enough food, or milk or bread to feed their kids. So they went to economies that were more stable. And in this case, the immigration wasn't to America as much as it was to Germany and Austria. Dr. Javor, would you like to add to this?
No, I think this. Oh, no.
Okay. Okay, so we're just going to quickly pass a few more phases looking at more modern migration history in Slovakia before we open it up for Q&A, and that's where you're going to be able to ask myself and Dr. Javor your questions. I think that from what I'm seeing from the comments, the greatest interest is in that Hungarian kingdom migration that occurred. So we will address that, but we just want to continue just so you have a great overview of the migration waves that are happening in Slovakia. So after 1989, 15 years later, Slovakia ascended to the European Union. And this is where the game really changed for our generation. So for me and Gabriela and many people like us, because Slovak passport holders no longer had to get visas or immigration permits, work permits to go live, work, and study in other parts of Europe. But all of a sudden, this is when we gained what they refer to as supranational citizenship. That means we were not just Slovaks with privileges in our country of citizenship, but we were also European citizens. And with being European citizens, we gained certain privileges. Gabby, can you mute Greg? Or Greg, can you mute yourself, please? Okay, maybe he doesn't hear. All right. So what happened after Slovakia ascended to the European Union is we we witnessed what they refer to as the new diaspora emerge in 2004, which is very interesting because it's about 100 years later after the peak of the original diaspora happened from the Kingdom of Hungary. The largest migration from from Northern Hungary, from Slovakia, occurred in years 1904 to 1907. And once Slovakia ascended to the European Union, 100 years later, we saw a tremendous migration wave happen between the years 2004 and 2008. And it was only curtailed because of the global economic crisis. So we saw some 200,000 young people go to Western Europe to work, study, and live. But what's very interesting about this new diaspora wave is that it is very different. Very different, I guess the slides aren't there, is very different from the old diaspora wave because the migration is happening in relatively close proximity to Slovakia, it's happening on the European continent, but also because conditions in Slovakia are improving. So for example, when I met my cousin in London, who was working as an architect post-EU accession, he had no intention of staying actually in England and becoming a British citizen. He had every intention to return back to Slovakia. For him, it was a short-term journey to develop his professional skills in another context, in a kind of a world-leading city for architecture that London is, make some money, and then come back to Slovakia where he would start his own business. So you're seeing a completely different mindset when people are no longer fleeing the country, but rather going abroad because they're curious, they want to learn, they want to make some cash, but they have every intention to come back to Slovakia. Of course, now we're some 15 years into the EU accession, and realities change once, for example, Slovaks become more settled in their foreign destination labor markets like Germany or England or France, or they fall in love with a native from that culture. So then you're seeing hybrid families happen, and then you're seeing actually once this young diaspora is abroad for 10 years or more, it's more unlikely that they will return just because they have children, their children are going to local schools. It's much more difficult and challenging to uproot and return. So that's something that's happening with the diaspora, that once Slovaks are abroad from the new diaspora after this decade, it's less and less likely that they will come back during their working life. But at the same time, we are witnessing return, and that's mostly these young people. And there have been studies done through the Slovak Academy of Sciences where they've done qualitative research, and they've interviewed families also in Eastern Slovakia 2 years after the graduation of their son or daughter at a foreign university. And what they found is that over 50% of these young people have in fact returned back from abroad. So this is where you're seeing that big shift, that this human capital that's people refer to as brain drain in the 21st century because of this new diaspora, this new exodus, is in fact actually coming back to the country, and maybe it's not even being registered by statistical offices. And this is where I believe Slovakia, and what my research looks at, has huge potential for growth, because for the first time we're not losing our talent. It has the potential to come back. And lastly, we're just going to move forward to the last slide. Oh, if it's not there, it's fine. And that's referring Slovakia transitioning from being an emigration country to an immigration country. And that has to do with the fact that we've been politically stable. We're relatively economically stable. We have good infrastructure. We're part of the European Union. We're part of the Schengen. We're part of the Eurozone. So Slovakia is becoming an attractive country for migrants. Whereas in the past, and even in the 1990s, when migrants traveled from further east, we're looking at Ukraine, let's say Belarus, or even from Yugoslavia, if they would ever come through Slovakia, and I think from Yugoslavia they wouldn't, so it would be more Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, Belarus, they would just come through Slovakia. They had no intention to actually stay here or to work here. Their destination labor market was Germany, whereas Austria were the rich economies of Europe. But now in 2020, we're seeing a shift where these nationals from neighboring countries further east are actually opting to stay here, to work here. They're trying permits, they're trying to learn the language. And this is a sign of the economic progress and success that the Slovak case study is demonstrating. So, Dr. Javor, would you like to add anything about, you were mentioning when we discussed how successful the Slovak industry is of late?
Áno, zo Slovenska sa z poľnohospodárskej krajiny stala najviac priemyselná krajina v Európskej únii. Vidíme na Slovensku, že sa ľudia vracajú naspäť a dokonca aj zo Spojených štátov amerických. Myslím si, že v Strednej Európe je budúcnosť. Táto nádherná krajina, ktorá si toľko za tie storočia vytrpela, myslím si, že má pred sebou úspešné roky. Veľmi nám pomohla Európska únia. To, čo sa stalo na Slovensku vďaka Európskej únii, je neuveriteľné.
So Slovakia has come a long way. It has been particularly the European Union that has improved matters for this beautiful country that so deserves it. And it's beginning to make it attractive again for people to stay rather than to leave.
And just to add to that, that is something, actually, this is our second book that we published under Global Slovakia. Oh, I'm so sorry. It's called The Great Return, and you'll receive an email about it where you can also purchase it. And it's a 300-page book. It's also a coffee table book. It's hardcover. It weighs about, I think, 3 or 4 pounds. It's very heavy. And it covers, rather than just the Great Escape, looking at the exodus of people fleeing our region to the detriment of the development of our country and our culture, we're now seeing a pivot where people have the opportunity to return. And they're talking about it. And there's organizations formed in the society that are addressing this issue, and the media is talking about it. So you can really see that it is something that is in the collective consciousness and also the unconsciousness, the fact that for the first time in history, Slovakia, because of its success, has the ability to attract back its human capital abroad. So The Great Return, just to give you a quick look into it, it has about 58 portraits. And these portraits are looking at, and they're interviews with these young Slovaks that went to various economies. I think in this case, she went to Vladimira, went to Denmark. She learned and saw a lot of new things, and was also exposed what these young Slovaks refer to as a new mindset. Now, if we touched on it in the beginning of this webinar, which is the fact that there is a mindset of victimhood and a mindset of powerlessness that has existed in our region because maybe some of the historical hardships we have experienced. You know, if you have the memory in your genetics of a village of 5,000 people in Michalovce perishing because of the plague, and only 5 families survived, that's pretty horrific, you know, and that's pretty traumatic. And the traumas didn't just end with the choleras and the epidemics, but they continued with the wars, the First World War, the Second World War, and of course, what followed the wars wasn't peace and rebuilding, but it was a rebuilding under the form of Soviet control that came with also its own horrors and labor camps and torture and imprisonment, under false accusations, etc. So there's been a lot of unfairness that has happened, or a lot of suffering that has happened in our region, and because of that there's a certain mindset of victimhood and apathy and maybe even depression that exists here. So it's really important for these young people that are the future of the country to get exposure to mentors, and those mentors can be in Slovakia, or if those mentors aren't available in Slovakia, one fast-track way is for them to go abroad and to go in societies, let's say that more market-driven societies, because that's the know-how that's missing in Slovakia and has historically been missing. That's why there was so much famine. And to see empowered people self-actualizing themselves, and through the application of their creativity and skills, creating, let's say, businesses or crafts that make money and can sustain their families. And that's kind of what I tried to capture in this book, is that people going out and being empowered by being exposed to new behavioral patterns, new thinking patterns, and then coming back with the intention to seed that knowledge back in Slovakia to help themselves, but also to help their family, to help their community, and to help the country at large. So this book has their stories. There's 25 returnees, and then there's perspectives from people in the government, perspectives of people in business and perspective of people in society, like Jura Jakubisko, for example, that give you a general overview of what homeland means, what roots means, and why it's really important for our young people to return. And if they don't want to return, at least try to help Slovakia in some way possible by helping to build with it, with new companies or with new cultures, because they have the language and skills in their destination labor markets where they establish their new lives. So I hope that wasn't a little bit too technical. A lot of my own personal research kind of bled into that, but let's open it up for Q&A, where you can ask Dr. Javor and I your questions about Slovak migration. Any questions?
So if I may open it, because there's a question that actually is great for the two of you, about the recent proposed dual citizenship law. Do you anticipate this helping the professional labor market as well?
Dr. Javor, would you like to do that one?
I don't understand, sorry. I don't hear the question.
Súčasná diskusia o dvojitom občianstve, ako ovplyvní Slovensko a či to pomôže aj slovenskému trhu práce?
Viete, ja som historik, ťažko mi k týmto politickým otázkam zaujať nejaké stanovisko, ale myslím si, že ten zákon o občianstve, ktorý bol na Slovensku predtým, nebol celkom správny, pretože Slovensko ako krajina, kde vlastne každý jeden skoro má niekoho niekde inde v nejakej inej krajine a veľká časť obyvateľstva sa vysťahovala riešiť občianstvo krajiny len jednej je podľa mňa nešťastie a myslím si, že sa to zmení. No na trh práce veľmi ťažko. Viete, ten trh práce na Slovensku aj teraz vďaka tomu nešťastnému covidu je paralizovaný. Uvidíme, ako to bude vôbec vo všeobecnosti ďalej.
So Dr. Javor comments that he's a historian, so he doesn't feel entirely entitled to answer this question, but he believes that the current state of the proposal is not so good for the country that has so many people living, so many people of Slovak roots living outside in so many countries. So he believes like the law should be structured better and perhaps it will improve with time. And it's also difficult to access the impact on the labor market, especially now with the epidemic going on. The situation changes fast and we have a lot of challenges that have been unforeseen and that we haven't been prepared for to deal with.
And just to add to that, so indeed, there's a lot of people with Slovak roots that are abroad. The largest number is these 2 million Slovak Americans. But I eventually think our country will pass a dual citizenship law where people that are able to show that they have Slovak ancestors will be entitled through pretty arduous bureaucratic process, will be eventually entitled to gain Slovak citizenship and therefore to have dual citizenship. It was possible to have dual citizenship actually up until 2010, where the law was changed because in Hungary, what they did, also Hungary has a lot of its population abroad, not just in the form of the immigration to the New World, but also in the regions on its periphery that were once part of the Kingdom of Hungary. And they passed a law where all those ethnic Hungarians living in other Central European nations are entitled to Hungarian citizenship. And it was a political move in Slovakia that then blocked this by saying Slovaks citizens, Slovak passport holders, are not entitled to have a second citizenship. But they are discussing this also because of the new diaspora and so many hybrid families forming abroad, and these children being born that are born to, let's say, an Italian father and a Slovak mother, or a German mother and a Slovak father, what to do with these kids and what kind of citizenship should they get, and most likely they should be entitled to both. So there's a organic pressure that is emerging on the government from this new diaspora that is asking for the rules to change, and the predecessor to dual citizenship being passed is the ability to be able to vote from abroad, which has started. It's still a little bit very bureaucratically difficult to do, but just the fact that Slovaks, the large diaspora, can vote from abroad is a huge shift. And then there's a movement to then allow Slovaks abroad to not just vote in the political elections on the national level, but also on the regional level, because they are citizens of the country and they should have a say in what happens in their community and in their country. But there again, there's a very political dimension to this. Certain political parties that are not, let's say, favored by the diaspora, which generally favors more liberal leaning parties, know that they would lose votes if this diaspora voted. So it's in their interest, in their political interest, to block Slovaks abroad from voting. And it's in the political interest of the more liberal parties to pass policies that allow Slovaks to vote from abroad, and also eventually have dual citizenship. And this dual citizenship law is nothing new. I mean, it's something that's already very common in Hungary. The Czech Republic recently passed a law where Czechs that are able, for example, in America, also are able to prove their Czech ancestry. They're entitled to acquiring Czech citizenship. So in a very short time, for example, Hungary was able to grow its population of Hungarians by 1 million people because they facilitated dual citizenship. So I think dual citizenship is something that can only help Slovakia, also economically and also professionally, because it can help become a bridge for Slovaks abroad to more connect with Slovakia.
If I just may quickly step in, I do apologize if I'm not supposed to, but in regards of the dual citizenship, there is many Slovaks that actually live abroad who are willing to lose their Slovak citizenship to then get, example, English citizenship and then apply for Slovak dual citizenship as an English citizen, and they are able to do that. So there is a way how people are applying for the dual citizenship. They just have to first give up their own Slovak citizenship and then apply for a dual citizenship as an English person. That's what we have experienced.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so this is Q&A time, so anyone that wants to jump in is free to jump in. And this is the way it works with life. There's always a law. I mean, and a law is just, it's one segment of the truth, and there's always ways around it. So that's really cool to learn that this is the kind of loophole to secure dual citizenship for Slovaks abroad. So thank you for sharing that.
May I just comment on the impact of the wars?
Sure.
Because World War I was important because it blocked connections and stopped migration from Slovakia to North America and elsewhere. And there are some Slovaks that tried to go back after World War I, and they found out that conditions in Slovakia weren't so great. And they went back to the United States or Canada or wherever. And more moved to Canada after the U.S. started passing anti-immigration laws, putting percentages on the number of people that could immigrate from East Central Europe. So World War I broke ties too. People couldn't write to each other. And then you have another war, World War II. So you have this period where people cannot write to each other. They don't hear from one another. And then the communists take over shortly thereafter. So both of these wars really disrupted the process and also facilitated and quickened the process of Americanization of Slovaks in the United States and Canada as well. Of course, new immigrants helped bring in new ideas and help a surge in ethnic consciousness and radio programs and the ethnic press. But the wars really had a very big effect on the Slovak ethnic communities.
Yeah, that's actually something we discussed with our class yesterday, which was the pressure to Americanize, especially after the Second World War. So in the late 19th, earliest 20th century, you had these ethnic enclaves where Slovak migrants came over. They had Slovak or Eastern European shops to buy their goods at. They pretty much socialized within their own Slovak community, and then they went to Slovak church where they had mass in Slovak. So they weren't actually forced to really integrate with American society. Of course, the longer they stayed, the more they assimilated. That's just natural. But after the Second World War, there was definitely this pressure, because obviously the commie threat, to really become American. And you had Slovak parents to speak Slovak with their children, or Slovak grandparents that were really wishing for their children to only speak English, so that they wouldn't be persecuted for being Slovak or for being Eastern European during this Cold War era.
Yeah, and the war had a lot of effect on the many men that went overseas to fight in the European and the Pacific theaters, because they were separated from their ethnic communities for a number of years. And when they came back, of course, they oftentimes settled down and have families and moved out of the ethnic neighborhoods. So the ethnic neighborhoods really started changing very quickly after World War II. So World War II was really pivotal.
And I think it's not just World War II, but it's really the commie threat, because the U.S. entered the Cold War, which was a war, although it was cold, and it was a proxy war that was happening on different territories. It was nevertheless a war. So I think because Slovakia was part of the Soviet bloc, it was a conscious and subconscious driver to distance oneself from the ethnic community. I'm just curious if things have shifted right now from the 1990s and also through to the early 2000s, with more and more Slovak migrants coming to America to settle, if there's an integration, or if there's still very much a gap between the original Slovak migrants and this new wave.
Well, from what I've seen, there's quite a bit of difference. It's a different generation, and they're mostly young people, and they think quite differently than the old-time Slovak Americans. And religiously, they're on different levels. The communists helped secularize society, and it did have an impact, especially on people in urban areas.
Right.
Tu je otázka, nie len čo urobila emigrácia dobre pre Spojené štáty americké, ale koľko vecí zachránila pre slovenský národ. Len jeden príklad poviem, zoberme si grécko-katolícku cirkev. To bola cirkev, ktorú komunisti v 50. roku zakázali. Prežila len v Spojených štátoch amerických. A trúfam si povedať, že keby táto cirkev nemala podporu zo Spojených štátov amerických, tak dnes grécko-katolícka cirkev na Slovensku nie. Je to obrovská vďaka týmto ľuďom, týmto emigrantom, ktorí tieto svoje cirkevné organizácie držali pokope, konec koncov suportovali ich, pomáhali im, a že tá viera a samotná cirkev v tých Spojených štátoch amerických a v Kanade a všade inde prežila. To len vďaka týmto emigrantom. My na Slovensku... Sorry,
so this is a good moment to pause and just appreciate just how the Slovak immigration helped the US and the countries to which Slovaks were coming to, but also just how much it helps Slovakia. So Dr. Javor drew an example of the Orthodox Church, the Greek Catholic Church in Slovakia, that was banned by the Communist Party in the 1950s. And it was only able to survive because of the Slovak immigrants in the US who kept it alive.
So that's why there was a big Rusin revival after 1989. It was the ideas coming from the United States and Canada that helped the church to revitalize in Slovakia following the Velvet Revolution.
So in a way, and this is kind of what my research argues, is that it's really important for these diaspora communities, whether it's the original one or the new one that's right now predominantly actually in Britain. That's where the most amount of Slovaks, young Slovaks, are abroad now. Numbers vary, but it ranges around 100,000. It's really important to continue these ties and not to sever them. If they are severed, it's to a loss of Slovakia's culture and development.
About Australia immigrants. Get off my.
Zuzana, you were muted.
I was muted. Okay. So sorry about that. So I had a little monologue there. Just basically saying that it's so important for these ties to be maintained, whether it's the original diaspora and now it's several generations of Slovak Americans, or it's the new diaspora where the predominant destination is actually Britain. Something like 100,000 Slovaks currently living there, because it helps Slovakia, and this is how ideas can actually travel. This is how innovation happens. This is how innovation has historically happened, is through cultural contact, intercultural contact, and having exposure to a wide spectrum of different ways of doing things. And being like, if you're, let's say, just in a landlocked country like Slovakia, behind the Iron Curtain, you perceive reality in a certain way, because that's the way you've been shown, and you haven't been exposed to different ways of doing things. And you can come to that naturally. That will happen with evolution and tinkering and trial and error, and have a quantum leap in development by just going to societies that, let's say, are more advanced in certain things. And right now it's that market know-how that's missing in Slovakia. So go to America, go to Germany, go to the UK, see how a market economy functions, download that knowledge, and come back and implement it and share that knowledge here in Slovakia to the betterment of the culture.
Okay, so do we have any more questions? If you do, please ask away. The last few.
I don't.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about the extent to which government corruption is an impetus, or has been an impetus, in the most recent emigrations, the post 89 or post 93.
Yes.
People being fed up with all the corruption in Slovakia and saying, I've had enough. I can't get anywhere. I'm constantly paying bribes. I want out.
Helen, very good question, if I can. Je neuveriteľné, ako korupcia na Slovensku vďaka postkomunistickému alebo komunistickému režimu prerástla úplne všetky oblasti spoločenského života. Snažíme sa proti tomu bojovať, ale táto korupcia spôsobila to, že keď ľudia prídu naspäť a vidia niekedy ten skorumpovaný systém, tak s nechuťou odchádzajú preč. Myslím si, že za posledné roky sa situácia zmenila, ale korupcia má zásadný význam pre masovosť emigrácie zo Slovenska.
So Slovakia has had yes, problem with corruption.
No, I'm so sorry. Please translate. Mm-hmm.
Yes, after 1989, in particular after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the transition years were really rough. And it certainly was a huge factor behind people emigrating, but it's also problematic for Slovaks who do decide to come back. Then they come face to face with corruption that kind of permeates all aspects of politics and social life and economy of Slovakia. They become disheartened and they decide to leave again because of that. So situation has been improving in Slovakia. Slovakia has been working on this, but corruption continues to be an issue, and it certainly is a factor that shapes migration, the recent migration wave.
Mm-hmm. So the new diaspora, there have been studies where various studies where they talk to these young people, these university students, etc., asking them what are one of the drivers. What are one of the push factors why they want to leave the country? And corruption is always cited, either first or second place. It's not so much about economic opportunities now, but it's just the corruption and the effect that it creates, that people don't want to live in don't want to function or raise families or start businesses in societies that are so corrupt, where the opportunities are so slated because of it.
Is the way of living in Slovakia really, people were automatically going to a dentist or a doctor or giving birth, and you automatically knew you have to pay the doctor some money behind additional, even though you didn't need to pay a doctor's, but people were prepared and they knew they have to pay. If you wanted to get children to universities, you knew you have always backdoor if you have the money. And it's just the way of living in Slovakia. If it's then letting people down and don't want to come back to the country where they know it's not right to live this way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the structural changes that have to be addressed if Slovakia is to retain its human capital.
But I think the things coming better now. It's not true that it's such you said it's better.
Mm-hmm. That's true. I mean, we do have to understand that the situation is constantly improving. And one of the reasons things are improving is that people are becoming economically more empowered. You know, that people have access to more capital now, there's more industry, there's more jobs. If you're not, let's say, high skilled or an entrepreneur, you can always find car factories. And that is in itself building a kind of middle class in the society that is stabilizing this rampant corruption that can only exist when there's an uber powerful class and most of the people are at the bottom. So a middle class helps to stabilize that imbalance, and has historically been the case the world over. It's not an exception in Slovakia.
Okay, do we have the, let's say, last question? Anyone?
Hi.
Hi there.
Do I have a connection?
Yes, you do. You're on the screen.
I'm a Slovak American. I live in Montana, and the coal mining and the silver mining brought many Slovaks to Montana. And I was wondering, what role do you see Slovak Americans in this large picture? I spend a lot of time trying to research my ancestors.
Sorry, what is the question? What role do Slovak Americans play?
Yeah, I really enjoyed your education on a lot of this, but I was just wondering, do you see Slovak Americans who can't return? What is their role?
I think the role is to support the country also in terms of tourism, you know, and support the country also in terms of contact. Slovak Americans have, especially multiple generations living in the US, have a completely different mindset and outlook on life, and also on economy, on topics like concepts like democracy. And I think it's just that transferring of that knowledge and that know-how is so important. And we experience this also in terms of global Slovakia. We have a lot of people that are part of our kind of advisory board that are Slovak Americans that are helping us create strategies to help to sustain, for example, our organization. Because, you know, here we have all this content, all this knowledge, but how can we exist as an organization? And we have these Slovak Americans that are saying, well, okay, you can do these practical things, you can sell these courses, you can market these books, and this will allow you, your organization to exist and for your research and education campaign to continue. So it really happens on this practical, very basic level, but it's tremendous knowledge exchange that is that's life-changing, you know. So I think it's just for Slovak Americans to feel, I think, also more welcomed by Slovaks in Slovakia because of that history where Slovaks in a way felt abandoned, or such was the narrative that went. They kind of shunned their backs on their families and on the community of Slovak Americans, you know. And I think that's such a shame, and that's such a loss, and that's so in a way self-sabotaging and self-destructive for Slovaks in Slovakia. It's in our interest to help to bridge build with our, let's say, our brothers and sisters that are abroad. It can only benefit us. And
thank you.
This is not something that's, again, this is not some rainbow unicorn talk. This is what other societies and other countries have strategically implemented also on a government policy level. You have Ireland that has extended its dual citizenship. a lot of bridge building campaigns with the Irish community in the US. You have countries like India, Taiwan, and China that are actively reaching out to their outbound populations in the interest with economic interest behind it, because they know that Taiwanese that are living in the Silicon Valley can help to connect, let's say, a research park in Taiwan with the services, with the companies that are in California, to the betterment of the Taiwanese economy. So it's also on a practical economic advantage to bridge build with the diaspora. And that's exactly what happened. Now there's 3 science parks that exist in Taiwan, and they have revenues of, I don't know, X billion per year, because they were able to bridge build with the professional diaspora of Taiwanese people in the Silicon Valley, for example.
Ak môžem ja, Greg, ja si myslím, že úloha amerických Slovákov je pre slovenskú spoločnosť nenahraditeľná. Slováci už niekoľkokrát, americkí Slováci už niekoľkokrát počas dejín neuveriteľným spôsobom pomohli Slovensku ako krajine, Slovákom ako národu. Myslím si, že vašou úlohou je uvedomiť si to, že ste Slováci, a čo najviac sa snažiť zistiť viac o sebe, o svojich predkoch, o svojej rodine. Viete, mne bolo do pláču, ja som bol vo februári v Spojených štátoch amerických a navštívil som niektoré slovenské kostoly. No keď som videl, v akom sú stave, bol som fakt šokovaný a nechápal som, prečo to je tak. Samozrejme chápem teraz, že v Spojených štátoch amerických je to trošku inak ako u nás na Slovensku, ale to považujem za hlavnú úlohu Slovákov v Amerike. Uvedomiť si svoju slovenskosť.
So Dr. Javor thinks Americans with Slovak roots play absolutely critical role in Slovakia and have always done so throughout history. Of multiple examples when Slovaks in America contributed to the development of the country. But he also thinks that the first and foremost, it's the responsibility, and what is important most is that Americans with Slovak roots, they get to know their Slovakness, get to know their roots, and really get to know the culture. So that's the first and perhaps the most important step to advance further.
And the responsibility also lies on the Slovak side. And I continue to stress that Slovaks here, also on a governmental level, need to extend their hand to Slovak Americans. And the same is going to be to the Slovak British that are now going to, grow into a very important professional class of expats. So it has to go both ways. The interest has to be in the heart of the people that are abroad and the desire to want to connect, but also from Slovakia to stop shunning these communities, stop thinking that these people abandon the country, and extend their hands and be open for knowledge exchange, for cultural exchange.
And perhaps this is also an opportunity to mention the museum initiative.
Yes.
Because that is something that can also play a very important role in all this, shifting the perceptions and improving the relationships. So if you could tell us a little more about that, o vašom múzeu.
Áno, samozrejme. Veľmi dôležité je, aby sme aj my na Slovensku vedeli aspoň niečo o emigrácii a o tom, ako sa naši predkovia prebárali tým ťažkým životom v Severnej Amerike. My na Slovensku nevieme o slovenskej emigrácii takmer vôbec nič.
So it's critical that Slovaks too know about their ancestors who went to America. They know about the difficulties that those that came before them were faced with. And this is something that in general Slovaks know very little about. We have very little information available about migration and Slovak emigration.
Slovenská historiografia, slovenská historická veda sa tejto otázke absolútne nevenuje. Ja som bol veľmi prekvapený, a keď so študentami mojimi hovorím, absolútne ani jeden historik na Slovensku sa nevenuje profesionálne téme vysťahovalectva.
So the Slovak experts on history do not actually devote any time or attention to this topic. This is a very understudied theme in Slovakia.
Jediná práca po slovensky, ktorá je písaná v emigrácii, je práca Konštantína Čulena, ktorá má už 80 rokov.
So the only work that has been done in this area is 80 years old now.
Preto som sa rozhodol, že sa budem venovať tejto problematike a založím na Slovensku múzeum emigrácie do Severnej Ameriky. O chvíľku zoberiem kameru a ukážem vám, akú mám pripravenú miestnosť pre zajtrajšiu prednášku pre slovenských študentov. Ľudia nevedia, keďže sa stratila tá kontinuita medzi Slovákmi, ktorí ostali na území Slovenska, a medzi tými americkými. Povedzme si na rovinu, kontinuita, to je to, čo hovoril pán doktor Kopanič. Kontinuita sa pretrhla 2 svetovými vojnami a komunizmom. Keďže tá kontinuita nie je, my sme stratili akýkoľvek, alebo ten kontakt s americkými Slovákmi je veľmi malý. My to musíme zmeniť, lebo sme týmto americkým Slovákom niečo dlžní.
So, as it has been said multiple times throughout this webinar, the continuity or the connection between the Slovakia and American Slovaks was cut. And there is very little in terms of bridge building going on. And this is something that we need to restore. And he believes that this is something that Slovakia too owes to those of Slovak roots in North America. And this is what drives his passion to set up a museum of immigration in Slovakia to raise awareness of this important topic and to help to restore the relations.
Nemáme na Slovensku inštitúciu, ktorá by nejakým spôsobom sa starala o dedičstvo amerických Slovákov. My na Slovensku nemáme ani najstaršie amerikánsko-slovenské noviny, ktoré vychádzali v Spojených štátoch amerických. A uvedomme si, že tieto noviny mali náklad 40 000 kusov, kým naše slovenské národné noviny mali náklad 2000 kusov. A my ich nemáme. My tieto americké noviny, ktorých bolo 400 rôzne tituly, my ich nemáme. A je to veľká škoda pre slovenskú historiografiu a pre slovenskú spoločnosť vôbec.
So to illustrate, there is no institution that would protect the heritage and the legacy of the American Slovaks or Slovak Americans. For instance, there was a newspaper, the first Slovak political newspaper, Slovak national newspapers, was published in a very small amounts in Slovakia, whereas the Slovak Americans published 40,000 copies of their own Slovak Americans newspaper. And Slovakia, you cannot find copies or any kind of archives that would protect and keep this legacy and this heritage for us, which Dr. Javor says is unacceptable, and it's a very sad loss for us, for the country.
Ak dovolíte, ja som si dovolil takú malú prezentáciu. Tuto mám pripravenú, this is my office in my university, and here I prepare some artifacts for tomorrow lesson about Americans about Slovak Americans. I have thousands of artifacts, all books, staré knihy, staré medaile, rôzne diplomy a tak ďalej. My o Slovákoch v Amerike na Slovensku nevieme vôbec nič. Nevieme nič o spolkovom živote a nevieme vôbec nič o ich každodennom živote.
So this is to correct the fact that we know nothing about Slovaks in America, know very little about how they lived. We know very little about how they gathered, got together, what activities they ran, etc. So this is a big unknown for us still.
To je dôvod, prečo ja som sa rozhodol toto múzeum založiť. Kúpil som na potreby tohto múzea dom v obci Ťahyňa, ktorý je postavený za amerikánske peniaze. Tento dom postavil človek, ktorý sa v roku 1890 vrátil z Ameriky, dal postaviť tento dom, vrátil sa naspäť, zarobil ďalšie peniaze, vrátil sa a dal postaviť grékokatolícky chrám hneď oproti tomu domu. Čiže tento dom je amerikánsky dom a bude nádherné mať v takomto amerikánskom dome múzeum emigrácie do Ameriky.
So it is for this reason that Dr. Javor decided to found this unique museum in the village Ťahyňa in eastern Slovakia, and it's really beautiful because the house that he bought to house the museum was actually built for the money earned in America. So it's symbolic, and it's very beautiful sort of continuation and restoration of those ties that were cut and disrupted in the past.
Všetkých vás pozývam na Slovensko múzeum pozrieť.
So you're all invited to come and have a look at it when it opens.
And there's just a question of what is the name of the village and where will the museum be? So all this will be answered in our follow-up email, where you can also learn how you can make a contribution to Dr. Javor's project, which will be a very important node for helping to bridge build between Slovak Americans and Slovaks in Slovakia, particularly in the heart of the region that has suffered the most population losses due to emigration.
Okay, so I think we're ready to close this off, but before we do, there will be information about the book that Zuzana mentioned, The Great Return, if you would like to look into the theme a little bit more. It's a very visual, beautiful book to leaf through. And if Slovakia interests you, if Slovak culture, customs, but also these kind of themes that we've been discussing today interest you, this is a part of our program, our online course, Slovakia Beyond the Known, that you can enroll to get access to all kinds of information, as well as a monthly exclusive webinar for our students, where we go more in depth in those themes that we select, and where there is more space to ask questions. So if that's something that interests you, that will also come in the follow-up email. There is an offer. If you purchase the whole 12-month course, you get a 20% off the regular course price. So it's a lot of material, and it's very well worth it.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
At any point will you discuss the impact of the United States Steel Corporation being in Košice for roughly 2 or 3 decades right now, either at another time or during this course?
It's not something that we actually, that could be a theme we could discuss in next month's contact. But I just want to know, actually, because Dr. Javor is from Košice, he would be able to share a little bit of a on the ground perspective of what that corporation and its impact on the community. Dr. Javor?
Yes, of course. No problem. I will be happy to continue this beautiful webinars and discussion about migration.
Ale on sa pýtal, že ako US Steel zmenilo spoločnosť. Impact. Aha, dobre.
I don't know. Sorry, I'm historian. I don't know answer this question.
Okay, so thank you for the idea. This is definitely something that we can look into in the future, to continue on this theme. So thank you for the suggestion. We will return to it in some way soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Yam, I should say.
Thank you. So if there's no more questions, we're going to be closing this webinar off. Please also, when you do receive our email, send us back your questions if there's other themes you would like us to explore in future webinars, or if you want us to address the migration theme more specifically, looking at a specific timeline or piece of history. We'll be happy to consider that for future content, because we really do want to work with you. We really do want this to be a co-creation between us and you as our audience. So we wouldn't exist if it weren't for you. So we're very, very grateful for your attention and time. And then just receiving some thank you. So thank you very much for everyone that joined.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne.
Ďakujeme, Martin Javor. It was wonderful to have you. And we wish you all a wonderful rest of a Sunday. And yes, do get in touch if you have ideas for future webinars. And we hope to see you again soon on one of our future online events. So thank you. Bye-bye and take care.